Hello, my name is Annette Deleu, and you are listening to The Heart of You. Welcome back. So today we are interviewing Suzanne Anderson. Now, Suzanne is the founder of The Mysterial Woman. She is a psychologist, author, coach, leadership consultant, and transformational teacher. Her pioneering work in guiding others to awaken their full feminine and masculine strengths combines insights and practices from ancient wisdom, depth psychology, and modern neuroscience. She facilitates global online programs, workshops, and retreats, and is the co-author of the triple award-winning book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How to Live, Love, and Lead. Her new book that I'm actually reading currently, which is phenomenal, by the way, is called You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss. It describes how her shattering, breaking apart was also a profound breaking through a deeper experience of her true nature. We are here to talk about Suzanne's experience and talk about this absolutely wonderful book that she has written. And as I said, I am about halfway through this book and I literally cannot put it down. Suzanne, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Annette, for inviting me into the conversation.
How I like to start these episodes is usually just to get a little bit of a background on you. And as I've been reading the book, your book sort of starts off with the impression that your spiritual nature has already been there for a while when you start into the book. What I'm curious about is sort of how you got there. So I guess we would be talking a little bit about what happened before. So how you first discovered your connection to the universe, how you first tapped into your intuition, and what your spiritual journey has been like.
Well, it's actually a good place to start because I would say that's the probably common thread through my life has been my connection to the aquifer of my being, we might say, so that underground river. And I actually woke up to that really quite young. And what I mean by that is I was probably 13, 14 initially, and I had multiple experiences of feeling like I was my ego would disappear and I would become one with nature in particular. We lived on the ocean in a town on the east coast of Canada, and I had a beautiful cedar tree that hung out over the ocean, and I would go up in that tree and it'd be moving in the wind, and I would see the long beach when the tide had gone out and the seagulls flying. And I had this amazing experience of just feeling so one with everything. But it was unsettling at the same time because I had no context for this. I grew up in a family where we had no religious approach at all. And so I wasn't rebelling against anything, but I also didn't have any context. This was sort of my teen years and feeling sort of like these two parts of me. One part of me that was in high school doing very well, an athlete, very much the mainstream. And then this other part of me that was very private and kind of feeling, maybe, am I crazy? Am I going crazy? Is this normal? Do other people experience this? And certainly didn't want to talk about it at that time. And then when I was 17, so right my last year of high school, our neighbor and it was probably his intuition. It was guided to do this, but he gave me this little book called On Having No Head by Douglas Harding. I don't know if you know Douglas Harding.
I don't know.
Teaching. No, he was really one of the early, what I would say, non-dual teachers. So Alan Watts was one of those earlier teachers.
Oh, right, yes.
And Douglas was in England. And this little book was really, I read this book, and it was the first time I actually read my experience. And where he was talking about this little book is a beauty. He's no longer alive, but he was an essential part of my own journey because I read that and I thought there's only one person in the world that thinks like this. I mean, I had no idea there was a spirit. I didn't know about Buddhism or Zen or anything. And so I set my sights on, I've got to go and meet this person, and ended up doing that and actually being the next year. Or I had to go. I did 1 year of university, and then I had a profound experience there with him and his community. So I'd say that was the beginning of my journey, and it was an amazing blessing. And I was, no question, I was guided there. And from that, there have been many other stops along the way. But my own sense of my, let's say, spiritual waking up has been the through line in my life without question.
Yeah.
And being guided to different communities or spiritual teachers or places on the planet that I needed to be on that journey.
Yeah. That's really incredible that it started so young for you, because that gives you sort of a large breadth of time to be able to cultivate and develop. And that's exactly what you've done, right?
I was many years inside different spiritual contexts, or let's say mystery schools, and so were for training or learning and awakening. But then there was the very big wake-up call. I call it the wake-up call from the light, which was in Bali, which I write about in the book a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was I was in my 30s, I guess it would be. Yes, 30s. And my sister lived in Indonesia, and I'd gone there to visit her, and we went to Bali. We were fasting and doing yoga and, got ourselves into quite wonderful states. And then I just had this profound experience of opening beyond my single self into a state of bliss with what I felt to be a feminine essence, and later came to consider that archetype or the energy I was infused with as a kind of Kuan Yin, the goddess of compassion energy. And my small self just disappeared completely for several days. And I was just held inside this absolutely exquisite love field. And sometime during that experience, the question came in to this field of awareness: will you help to midwife the divine feminine on earth? I had no mind to say yes or no to that. I just knew every cell in my body that's why I'm here, of course, yes. And so later, when my little single self started consolidating, I came out of this state. I was like, what have I just signed up for? Because I was inside a masculine, guru-centric spiritual tradition. I was a very high-powered, I will say, management consultant based in Paris and working in this mostly male domain.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, what did it mean, what I had just signed up for? But it was so obvious to me that this was part of my journey, that what I incarnated to be a part of. And that led me then into the work that I did, that you were describing in the bio there.
When you were working in sort of the corporate space, meanwhile, you're exploring these other spiritual sides of yourself, did you ever feel at odds with where you were with the corporate space and then the spiritual space? Did it feel congruent together, or did they feel sort of separate?
Well, it felt very congruent until it didn't, so I felt like an undercover agent and I loved it, because I actually feel that is my role.
Yeah.
I feel I am a bridge person. I am here. And even when I was younger, it was pretty clear to me. It was, just to be in a state of bliss, feel one's oneness with all wasn't enough. Like, how is that changing the world? How is that changing others? How is that a contribution? In fact, early in my spiritual journey, I specifically went to live in a community that was focused around juvenile delinquents. So it was a spiritual community, but this was in southern Ontario in Canada, called Twin Valleys, actually. And I thought, I want to make sure that my this way of being translates into how I show up in the world. And this was a really difficult population. It was an incredible experience. So for me, later when I ended up becoming a consultant and I was in that world, I brought a lot of my understanding, but translated it in some of the early experiential learning things that we did with executives. But I was actually having them do experiences. And my presence and my ability to translate. So I had to learn what I would call the masculine skills of the organizations, or understand leadership in this case. But I was bringing them to understand their heart, to start to understand their body messages, to kind of wake up in a way that was relevant for their corporate experience. So I actually loved it. But then at a certain point, after this awakening in Bali, where I just knew this is done.
Yeah. And I think that happens for most of us, right? Where you get to a point where it's like, okay, now I need to embody all of these skills that I've learned, all of these things that I've done, and put it all into one grand work, which is exactly what you've done with this book. It is so beautifully written in so many different ways, because not only do you weave like a tapestry, the poetry, the storytelling, the tools, your experience, you really take the reader with you on your journey. It's palpable. You can feel what you're going through in terms of the transition, in terms of the tools that you're saying, okay, hey, this is how I went through this particular small portion. Even though it was something that was so big that you were going through, you're breaking it down into little bite-sized pieces. And it sounds to me as if your experience in the corporate space, all of this sort of prepared you exactly for this moment of writing this book.
Well, yes, let's say it did, but there's a big gap there. We got to account for.
Sure.
When I transitioned from being a consultant, so the consulting was great, and as I say, there was a time when I needed to respond to what it meant to midwife the divine feminine on earth. So I started a private practice in Paris, and I was coaching there for a year, and then my first husband and I moved to the United States, and he was having a joint venture with an American company. And because I didn't have I'm Canadian, I didn't have a visa to work, but I also knew at that time that I was only like one coaching session ahead of my clients. There was something I needed to understand about women and development. Like, what is really happening here? This isn't just about, and this became clear pretty early, it's not just about teaching new behavioral skills. Okay, so here are some new ways of being that will help you. That something else was trying to happen with women. So that was 10 years of research. And that work was profound. And I put those programs, I went back to graduate school, first of all, and did the research on women and development and clinical psychology. But then I started running my programs through a university, so that this consideration of women and the awakening of this next level of leadership wouldn't get put over in the eddy somewhere. It was that work, I would say, that deeply prepared me as much as anything could for the trauma that hit right when the first book was getting ready to come out. So after 10 years of research, we'd figured some things out. We knew what was happening for women. And I would say it like this. I'd say, Einstein has that wonderful quote we all know, you can't solve the problems of today with the consciousness that created them yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We actually have to expand our consciousness, and then our leadership capacity comes from that. So that's an evolutionary moment we're talking about. And what I began to see in the women I was working with was that we as women were really on one of these evolutionary edges. I call it sometimes the frothy edge of evolution, which is very difficult, where women were kind of being pushed up against the limits, and men, by the way, but my research was with women, the limits of their way of being that was mostly formed in a masculine model of consciousness that had been over the kind of the overriding paradigm for 5,000 years in Western culture. We had figured out how to start to unlock this next level of consciousness by doing the deep work around very specific feminine and masculine archetypes. And at the end of that, we knew we'd figured some things out, because we were starting to see these profound ways of being in the world. So we wrote a book, my co-author and I, Dr. Susan Cannon, and we were getting ready to bring it out in the world at the end of 2012. And in early 2013, which is where this book comes in, I came home to find my husband dead, and dead by suicide. So that was an enormous shift from where I thought I was going and what I was, what I call this the dark wake-up call, the she force that said you will come down now into the dark just as much as you went into the bliss and light in Bali, and you will learn to see in the dark. That was the invitation. So this book was the book you're referencing was many years later.
So when you were building up to how you pulled all of these tools together, you seem to have gotten this sort of really symbiotic connection to, as you were saying, like modern neuroscience, psychology, spirituality, all of these things. And that's kind of what I was referring to earlier, which is like your ability to weave all of those together and all of that that came before to put this book together is nothing short of, I would say, miraculous, because there are a lot of people out there right now in this moment who will really focus on, let's say, the psychology of it, or they'll focus on the science of it, or they'll focus on the spirituality of it. But it is rare at this time for all of those things to come together at once, let alone at once in one book. Did you know that this was all coming together the way that it did while you were going through this, 10-year process, even longer, I would say probably before that even? Did you know all of these pieces were coming together so it would lead you to this?
I had been figuring a lot out in the 10 years of the research, with working with hundreds of women. And I would call that very trial and error. We were literally trial and error, figuring things out. And this was not just a spiritual journey. This was about the embodiment, and the embodiment coming down and in, let's say, being more present here on earth, here in this body, awake. And the work that we do with women has to do with developmental trauma. So it's really going back and working with these very young parts that got split off into the shadows for a good reason, because we learned how to get love, safety, and belonging by doing that. Like if, you're in your family, if it was not a good thing you didn't get the love you were looking for when you expressed your strong opinion, it's pretty quickly that goes off into the shadows. And you wisely, what we call the adaptive child, learn how to be, accommodating all the time.
Right.
Which works fine for a period of time. But then, of course, if you're on a developmental pathway and you want to keep awakening, you want your voice, you want your agency, you want to be able to do things. So that's the work I was already doing, was this kind of what I would call that sort of trauma work. And that means there's a neuroscience to that, there's a psychology to that, there's an embodiment to that. There are very specific practices involved in building that capacity that the first book really, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, goes into. So I could say I knew this, and I certainly knew it. I was teaching it. I had embodied an awful lot of it, or I couldn't have really been a transformational teacher in that space. But when this occurred, this tragic and very sudden event occurred, I had the operating system I had, basically.
Right.
I had what I had, and this was going to be my journey now. And that what was super important to me, and I'd say to anyone who's listening to this, who may be going through a loss, and it does not have to be as dramatic, let's say, because I lost everything within 6 months. All the ways my outer identity was shaped, but it could be the loss of a phase of life, could be the law where your youth, you're not quite as young, or it could be the law your child goes off to college, or you have children for the first time, or a relationship ends, or whatever these losses are. That one of the critical, really, pieces for us is, and this is where the title of the book comes from, You Make Your Path by Walking, is to come here now, like to be able to really be where you are and be with what has happened or is happening. And what I'm trying to say is, this was my daily practice to be not on this path through the incredible devastation of my life to get somewhere. Like, I'm going to be it's all going to be better when I get through this, but rather being right here, right now. This is the moment, and I do not get it back. This is the day. I will not get this back. And how much can I really be here with this? And what I experienced, and I believe, is that if we're able to do that, it very much determines the path that unfolds.
Yeah. Now, when you were going through this trauma, and I'm not going to sort of go into the whole story because your book just says it beautifully about everything that unfolded and what you were going through, did you immediately pick up those tools that you had been studying, that you had been using and developing all these years? Did you immediately pick up those tools? Because sometimes I find that, like, when I go through traumas personally, I have all these tools at my disposal that I've learned over the years, but sometimes when you go through that initial trauma, the first thing is not to grab the tools. It is to literally be in that grief and be in that sadness and not know what to do. How were you able to grab onto those tools? Were they already sort of a habit for you? And how did that work?
Right. Well, I think you're right also about just the initial trauma. The prefrontal cortex just snaps off, trying to protect us in a certain sense.
Yeah.
So we can do fight, flight. We can go, we can run, we can deal with the situation. So that's the case. So I certainly wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to be, needing these things, or I'll pull out my manuals, or I'll pull out the manuscript of the book I just, written. But
right.
Absolutely not. But I would say what is true is that I had already a lot of practices in place in my life that are my container. And I think the container that we have and we create for ourselves is everything.
Yeah.
In other words, and so I have very specific and had morning practices that I always do, that are a writing practice and a meditation practice and a movement exercise practice and an altar practice. So I already had that, and I miss it when I don't do it. So I would say that was something that was just baked in. I think I also had an understanding of the potency of the field that I would be in. So the resonant field, we could say, my own limbic system, my own system to resonate with others that were holding some of those more conscious pieces when I was in my descent. And so I had amazing friends and family that came around me from the very beginning. And it meant I had to receive. Because I was more used to being the teacher, the one extending, that was sort of my identity. So it was a shift for me to be the one needing to receive. But I knew I needed to receive and let in the wisdom and the love, my community around me. So that was super helpful. I have one friend I remember, I would forget to eat initially, and she would sit with me, and every now and again, like a little baby bird, she'd have a little plate of food, and we'd be talking about things, and she'd just put a little fork full of food in my mouth. And,
yeah.
There were wonderful people around me in the early days when you do need to, with this kind of a trauma, fall apart, but let yourself be broken open, let's just say.
Yeah.
And then being able to have even just one good friend, one good loving surround is so powerful.
Absolutely. And because of those friends and the reminders that you had of ritual and the spirituality of it, in that one of the first things that you did was try to help him cross over.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was so beautiful that was almost a first instinct that happened. It's beautiful to be able to know from that standpoint that, oh, okay, yes, his soul is here, and I need to make sure that he's going to be okay, that he's going to cross over, right? Now, I can understand that probably wasn't just the complete logical thought in your brain. It was probably just an instinct, but it's something that it's so part of the grieving process, is to know that your loved one is okay.
What was very, I would say, synchronous, and I believe had to do with my guides preparing me for what was going to happen, was that several months before David died, I was obsessed with reading about the afterlife and the transition actually from this world to the other. So I had read, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying and the Journey of Souls and the Destiny of Souls, and a number of these books that write about from different perspectives what it is to actually transition from this world into other dimensions. And I would at night, I'd be sharing with David, this is incredible. Like the Tibetan, they say this, and it's so close to what this is said over here in this book. And, just comparing and contrasting and understanding. And he would always say, you should get a fiction. This is like sort of intense to be reading, isn't it? But actually, I believe I was being prepared, and I was preparing for this transition, although I didn't imagine it. I mean, I didn't certainly expect it, that he would take his life and do it at that moment, right before a family wedding and my book about to launch and everything else. But when he died, because I had done that and I had this in me, and because I also had been in ritual as a very deep part of the work I do, and that I teach women how to use that language because it speaks to left and right hemispheres of the brain, to the conscious and the unconscious. It is, of course, unfortunately, a language that we've mostly forgotten how to speak in Western culture, although certainly indigenous cultures have not forgotten that. I knew that ritual was really important for much, not just for David, but also for me, for those of us left. So this was before I actually knew that he had taken his own life. I think that was interesting because my friends had known that. They hadn't told me yet. I'm actually glad they didn't tell me before I did this, because I don't know, that was such a rude awakening to imagine that he had this terrible tinnitus, or ringing in the ears. It had been going on for about 3 months and was absolutely, literally driving him crazy. And he wasn't sleeping, and he couldn't get in these high states spiritually in his meditation he used to get into to figure life problems out. And so I assumed he'd had a brain tumor, or, I made up the story. That's what I thought had happened. He had died of an aneurysm or something like that. So I was able to be really with, and then another synchronous thing that I write about all of this in the book, but one of the friends that helped me, and in fact, helped me when I found David the night we were looking for him, she had a friend over. She herself is a shamanic practitioner, and her friend was over who was a shamanic practitioner who happens specifically to work with helping people cross over the end phases of their lives. And she had her, you could say, spiritual bundle with her in her car.
Yeah.
And she got it. And so she actually led this ritual. I'd never met her before.
Mm.
It was a very powerful experience to really see him leave. I mean, I could actually see him moving, and I saw him turn when we kind of gathered the energy and look back and sort of acknowledge the connection, but then turn and keep walking. And when I spoke to her afterwards, and I was, blessing him on his journey and all the things that I knew to do to guide his soul. But when I spoke with her afterwards, she said, in all the years of the work that she'd done, it had been rare to see a soul so clearly moving in the direction of the next level. Like, there's often the hovering and the staying behind and the resistance and the not finding the light. Like, in some way, he knew what to do and he was going.
Yeah.
And that was, that moment before I knew that he had taken his life, it was comforting, I think.
Yeah.
To see he knows what he's doing and he's doing it. And later I had to wrestle with, that experience of him choosing to leave and then just getting out of Dodge.
Right.
But in that moment, it was very powerful for me, and I hope it helped release him on his journey. And the other women, I had several other women with me holding this field.
Have you spoken to him since he crossed over? Have you been able to speak with him through a medium or anything?
I have, and later in the book you'll read more about that.
Oh, perfect! Oh, I can't wait.
I went to see many different people. I knew to wait at least 3 months from the things that I read about, the time it takes for souls to just be ready to engage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was very disappointed initially with different people I talked to. And I didn't really feel that either they told me he wasn't ready, which was very disappointing, or I just didn't resonate with what they had said. And I was waiting every night for a dream, praying for dreams, inviting him to come to me. And then that the first opening was actually a dream. So I do absolutely feel I was in Italy for sure. In my experience, I felt his communication and remorse. And it was very, very important for me, deeply healing. And I write about that experience in the book. And then not long after, I did speak to someone who I did feel David was able to speak to me through. And I spoke with her numerous times, actually. And I think initially it was very important to understand, because one of the things in a suicide that you're left with. Now, he did leave me a note, which was a little bit helpful for sure, compared to some suicides where there's just no understanding of anything.
Right.
And I knew that he was just done, that he just didn't have the energy to be with what was about to come tumbling down in his world, the business that he had built.
Yeah.
But I think the communication with him helped me understand a little bit more about that, and also helped me in the real world in terms of things I needed to think about or, pay attention to. Yeah, that was very, very powerful. And I've actually felt him very present in this phase of the book launch. It's interesting. Because when I certainly did not imagine I'd be writing a book when all of this happened. I was just trying to live the way of the Mysterial Woman and get my first book published.
Of course.
That was, and just see if I could really live this. I mean, I was 100% committed to that, as I write about in the book. So I wasn't going to get ahead of myself and write something that I wasn't living. But eventually, when I needed to come back to myself, I came back to just do my own writing, to write myself back together.
Yeah.
5 years after he died, and then decided there was a book in it. So here it is now coming out. And I can see that it is a really important part of my own initiation. And I can feel David sort of here in this phase.
Yeah. Do you feel that anything sort of changed in your process of the way of the Mysterial Woman between the time that you wrote that book and then now writing this book, You Make Your Path by Walking? Has anything shifted based on this experience of trauma that you had? Did you change the way that you would approach any of the 8 ways? Because in the Mysterial Woman, you say that there are 8 ways, right? So did any of those shift and change after you went through the trauma?
Here's what was interesting was that when I finally came around to realizing I needed to write, and I did this one way and did this writing for a week at a time over a couple of years. Then I showed the writing to the editor of the first book, and she said, "This is an offering for others. You've got to do something with this. You've got to write this as a book." And so I started to pull that together. Okay, what would that look like? I could feel that was correct for me to do. And obviously, I'd been living the commitment I'd made was to walk the way of the Mysterial Woman, which was the work I'd done. Mm. And this is about having these 5 feminine and masculine archetypal energies running in myself. So that's the mother, the hero, the father, the maiden, and the crone. Those are the 5 primary archetypal energies, feminine and masculine. Mm-hmm. That I was living, but it would seem more complex than that. And I thought, it's not just that I had this, I knew in this case, I needed the hero energy of agency and penetration, or in this moment, I needed the mother self-compassion or whatever. And I went back to my first book, and the second to the last chapter in the book, we had identified 8, what we called metacapacities. So basically, these were the ways of being that were starting to arise in women. This goes back to what I started with in our conversation. These new ways of being that are aligned with the complexity of these times. You could say the evolutionary edge. And these ways of being, just to give you an example of them, multidimensional knowing, embracing paradox, authentic presence, energy stewardship. There are 8 of these altogether. I won't go into them all. But then I realized that's what I did. I actually lived these capacities. In the first book, we actually say, we are only just starting to see these arise. Please let us know what you are discovering, what you're finding out there, you women on the edge of evolution. And I realized that's what I'd been doing, that I was actually living the metacapacities. So that then I had that the whole middle part of this second book is using a personal story to describe that metacapacity. What does it actually mean to use multidimensional knowing, for example? Applying, in a sense, what we just started to see as the map makers in the first book, actually showing how I lived them in the second book.
So it's an expansion, essentially.
Absolutely, 100%. It is the lived embodiment. And this was something that's really different as well to respond to that question for me now, which is in the first book, we have a lot of case studies so that women can see what does this actually mean to embody the healthy mother. What does that look like? What does that look like to have the capacity to embody the healthy hero and have the boundaries and have clear goals and move toward them and so on? And what's the shadow work you have to do there? What do you need to do? So I think there's a way in which I knew a lot then, but now it was really for me living very personally this story as my story. So I have not, as a teacher in general, told my own stories. And during these 10 years, in the first book, I only just referenced in the acknowledgements that my husband had died. Because that first book wasn't about that. It was already written.
Right.
And it was with my co-author. It wasn't the thing to do. So there's something very different for me and very vulnerable to bring my own personal story in as a teaching. And that feels really different. That's a new ground for me. And I think a lot of people get this book and then go back and get the first book, because in many ways, the first book is the recipe. These are the practices you need to be doing. These are the ways you get to the next level capacities that you need to cultivate.
I know you're saying that, typically in this space, sharing your own stories as a teacher is not something that has been done in the past, but I feel that moving forward, that is exactly what needs to be done, because totally. I find that the ways that I connect with people the most is when I'm sharing my deepest, darkest shadow that I don't want people to see, that I've been hiding for ages, right? So it's like those things that you feel are your Achilles heel, let's say, those are the things that people are going to connect to, and it's going to help them tenfold from what it could if you were just saying, well, this is how you do this, or that is how you do that. Like that, people can't connect to that. They want to connect to your story, why you're doing the things you're doing, how you came to where you are now, and where they can connect with you in your story.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I do think it was a different day when I was starting the work that I was doing. I was very mindful about where my story, and I still am, where my stories serve the client or the student. It's not just about me telling my story so I can have fun telling my stories.
Sure.
Like because I do see a lot of that too, which I find kind of not so interesting. But at the same time, for me, one of the things that's so different about this, and this has only been out for a couple of weeks, so I'm on the leading edge of this, is that people will feel and do feel when you read someone's intimate memoir that they know you, that they like, you've just opened your kimono, and you've said, come in here to my story and may it be helpful for you, because you can see how I did this. And this is why this is not just a memoir. And I think there are many books that are just memoirs, and they're beautiful. This is a memoir guidebook, as I call it.
Yes.
Because I'm also pointing you toward these metacapacities, like what it would be to really, the possibility, I guess we could say, that during these disruptive times in our lives, and there are many, many of these happening for all of us, because I feel this is the evolutionary wake up. I mean, this is how we grow. But if you can live those in a way to harvest or let's say align with the transformational potentiality, it is so different than just the thing you have to survive to hope to get back to something you were doing before. But, really allowing the mystery of your becoming to be where you are able to sort of hook your beyond belay, let's use a climbing metaphor, to something that you do not know. In my case, I, as I mentioned, had lost everything in the outer world. Sometimes I use the example of the Tibetan sun mandalas. Have you ever seen those done?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah, an amazing ritual process. And they create, first of all, on a paper, what this elaborate mandala is. And then there's chanting, and it goes on all day and night and for quite a period of time. They have these tiny little, they're called chakpurs, but they're little like funnels that grains of sand go through. And they tap them in these little colored sand, over multiple hours, creates this amazing pattern that you see. That's just absolutely exquisite. But at the end of this whole ritual, they take a broom and they just sweep it all away. It's like it's just gone. And that, because I have been through the one of those ritual ceremonies, and it's an amazing process, and it's really introducing you in a cellular way to impermanence. Like there's the beauty that you create in that moment, and you're very fastidiously, carefully creating, but then you release it because was just then. And that really for me was so important all from the very beginning. Like your past is gone. That life, you're not putting back together again. This will not be happening. This is gone. And so that ability to really be here now for oneself and for the moment unfolding was critical for me. And I think is actually for anyone going through these times.
Yeah. It's interesting that this is what you're talking about at this moment, only because I do a weekly channeled message on this podcast. And as we're recording this today, I just recorded this week's channeled message, which would be airing in July. And this episode is airing a little bit later. But the channeled message was about exactly that. It was about how you identify yourself and how you define yourself based on the things you like, the hobbies you have, all of these material things, all of the things that you have. And not that any of it's bad, but just that we hold on to them so tightly. So if you used to like something before, let's say it was a particular type of movie, or let's say it's a particular type of artwork, and you used to really like that maybe 20 years ago, but now it's just living in your space and it's always been there, but you don't actually notice it anymore. You don't actually even like it anymore, but it's just there because it's always been there. It's like being able to decide in every single moment, in every single day, what is it that I truly want and what is it that I truly love today, and being able to open that space for something new to come in, to allow that flow of events, that flow of things to come through you, and being able to let them go as they do. So that's exactly what you're talking about with the mandalas. It's like, appreciate it for the moment that you have, that particular moment, whatever it is, but then let it wash through you, let it move past.
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful. And I think sometimes, and if you're going through a difficult time in your life, the tendency can be either to fixate on what was before, that sort of trying to hold on to what was, or there's also the sense of I've got to figure this out ahead. Like I know this isn't working anymore, but I can't let go of that unless I can see what this is out ahead of me. I understand it. It's a kind of I understand the human aspect of that. But what is that in fact required here, and it does take a leap of faith, is that like the trapeze artist, you let go of one trapeze. You can't grab a hold of the next one until you're in that in between. And this is therefore growing the capacity to be with the mystery, which is where the term mysterial actually comes from. One part of it is that ability to be with the mystery, to not know. But in our sort of rational scientific worldview, we often think our safety is in knowing, and we reduce ourselves and our potentiality then, because actually what's trying to unfold is often so much larger than the self that the current consciousness can even picture.
Right.
Just when we're little, you can't imagine ourselves, further down the road as a child, all the things that we'll have when we're older. And it's, unfortunately, as adults, we often think, oh, we're all grown up and we don't need to keep growing. But in fact, we do And that is the developmental, I'd say, imperative right now, is that humans are willing to turn on the developmental tap, because we have to grow more capacity to, in the ways that I've described, to meet the complexity and the difficulties of these times that we're in.
Yeah.
And we don't do that by staying in the same comfortable zone that we've always been in. People in my programs have created little T-shirts and other paraphernalia to represent my basic mantra in this work, which is welcome discomfort.
Yeah.
You really have to, because, often there's a sense of that means I'm going in the wrong direction. I shouldn't be uncomfortable. But no, you actually should be uncomfortable. That when you are in a growth phase, and we're not always there, but that's how you know the next level is trying to get your attention. This next level of your becoming, or phase of your becoming, is giving you a little wake up call.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it's something that in between space that you're talking about, and I say this to my clients as well, is that when you're in that void, in that space in between, that is often the space that we as humans try to avoid on a regular basis. And how do we avoid it? Well, we fill it with fear. Okay, cool. So I don't want to sit with this empty space of not knowing what's going to happen. So I'm going to go into my fear of, well, what if this would happen? Or, well, that happened last week, so that might happen now. And, like that whole dialogue you have in your head. And then, you go
Right.
to the future of, oh, well, I don't know what could happen, and that could happen, or that could happen, that kind of thing. This is something that I say all the time, given the fact that so much of my work is in the Akashic Records, which is looking at past lives or concurrent lives or whatever it happens to be. But knowing context is so important to get people unstuck sometimes. So to be able to sit in that space of the unknown is one of the greatest gifts to be able to do, because you're allowing something
Absolutely.
different to come in from what you have ultimately manifested in the past, right? So manifesting fears by filling that space with more fears, right?
Sometimes I'd say we've come with, in a way, we've come to our real work when we don't know which direction to go. It's that moment that you could say the potentiality of the future self, who is already out there on that probability path of your greatness, of your wholeness, has so much more possibility of being reached.
Yeah.
But we have to get to that place. And I certainly did when I lost everything.
Yeah.
I really didn't know. I could only know, and I had to keep surrendering again and again and again to this one thing I could do now, this one next step. And that is so key. This one next step. What is that thing now you need to do?
Yeah. When you got this vision early on, or this download, this intuition that you would be midwifing the divine feminine energy, did you understand, or maybe I should ask it this way, do you feel that the way in which you've developed these 8 ways have been able to not only help those divine feminine people who have divine feminine and divine masculine within them, but this can also help men on their journeys, especially given the loss of David and the pain that he was in, and
Right.
the wounding that men are in general. So we often spend so much time vilifying men for the patriarchy, for the structures that are in place. And yeah, a lot of them suck and a lot of them need to be broken down. But at the same time, men as a whole need to be healed in addition to that. So do you
100%.
feel that this can help them as well?
Well, when the first book came out, many men read it and would say they could relate to the feminine and the masculine archetypes that we had identified as a developmental pathway. I think it unfolds a little differently for men in terms of development than for women.
Sure.
But the basic idea of cultivating these yin and yang essences inside ourselves, 100%. And I had to make the choice early on whether I would try to do this with men and women or try to do this just with women. But it was so clear to me that the feminine force, this feminine wave, it has been coming in. And if you read my first book, we kind of go into some of the history of that and the way development, unfolded in these streams of consciousness. We're now in the seventh one of those big waves. There's a way that feminine is coming in men and women. I mean, it must come in. In other words, these ways of knowing beyond the masculine and what had become hyper-masculine consciousness are simply needed.
Yeah.
But if women weren't getting this, if we weren't waking this up, then there was going to be a real problem. And I was seeing women suffering so much because they kind of hardwired some of the masculine ways of being, and they were the most challenging to work with in the corporate environment I was in. It wasn't the men when I was coming to bring these more, learning to share power and get out of the silos in organization and so on. It was actually a lot of the women that were the most resistant. So, but I 100% agree that this evolutionary imperative is certainly not just for women at all. And the second book I wrote in a way that I've had already heard from lots of men who've read it, that I think it will be, you don't have to be in a female identifying body to have it be meaningful for you. And even to go back and get the first book and use the archetypes to understand more about the feminine and masculine in yourself. I think that the divine, what we say divine feminine, divine masculine, this is just a way of talking about the beauty of the exquisite beauty of the seed code of humanity, of the cosmos, which is yin and yang.
Absolutely.
And so we all have that in us, and the journey, I believe, of our, and the kind of what we could call waking down, not just waking up, but waking down and in, is actually to bring that soul essence into the world and show up in the world and make a difference because of the way you show up in the world. And I've been always very interested, and that's why there's a kind of element of leadership here. It's redefining what leadership is, just not about power over in some old model.
Right.
It is about really showing up authentically, fully as yourself. And as you do this, and I've seen this with hundreds of women I've worked with, that when they shift their own codes and actually start vibrating in this frequency that I call mysterial, it's profound, the changes that happen in their family dynamics, with their children, with their partners, in where they work. I used to get people referred from Microsoft all the time. I'm here in Seattle, Washington. They didn't really know what I did in my programs. They just knew that the women that did the work were so different. The way they were leading was so profoundly different and effective.
Yeah.
That they would send people to. Boeing was the same. Many of the companies that are local here did the same. So, this needs to translate, is the point I'm making. It's not enough for it, I believe, at least where my own sense of mission has to do with the showing up in the world. You wake up, you grow yourself up, and you show up in the world. And in this particular time, these kind of tipping point times, we are 100% needed right now.
Yeah, I agree. Most of the time when these types of transitions seem to happen on a small scale and on a grand scale, when you are trying to usher in new energy, that new energy has to lead. And that new energy has to lead in a confidence and a security that is knowing that this is the direction that we must go, right? So, i.e., the feminine energy, the divine feminine energy is leading the way at this moment and will be, from what I've seen, for quite some time. And it's not to say that it is the divine masculine is going away. It's that balance between the two, as you were saying, that it's seeking, and the feminine is leading the way to that balance.
Right. And this is a really important distinction, because I think, and it's certainly in the work that I do, it is not just about the feminine.
Right.
But that has been in the background. And by the way, that is how evolution unfolded, not a mistake. Let's just say that's what it's been. But now there is a need for the conscious feminine to come in. And when that happens, and it's woven together with the conscious masculine in ourselves, we have something very, very different that starts to happen in that alchemy. I call it a mysterious way of being, because I just literally, as I said, couldn't find a way to describe what starts to happen. Because we also have to get the masculine healthy. So for sure, the patriarchy is not just outside us. It's only outside us because it's inside us. So the work I do with women is actually getting in touch with the ways that we have internalized that patriarchy inside her. And we have to do this work. Now we're seeing in culture right now a lot of this shadow material coming up. We see it here in the United States with some of the leaders that have been, holding power. We see it in Ukraine, in Russia, where we could say the shadow masculine, which is power over and, my way or the highway, and, the isolation and all of the individual focus consciousness that is a part of the patriarchal mindset. But I see it as the necessary kind of cleansing of the shadow. This didn't just come about now, we could say, right? This has been there, only not conscious. We've had this way of thinking, way of being, and it's, from my point of view, it's actually essential that it comes out of the unconscious. We can see it coming out collectively. But in the long arc, it won't. There's no way the patriarchy is going to be the final say, but we have to do the work in ourselves so that we can be part of that force that is actually metabolizing the old pattern.
Well, because the old pattern is rooted in insecurity and hurt. So when anybody is grabbing for power, or like you were saying, even the women who were in resistance at the corporate space of, sort of softening that, it is because of the insecurity of not feeling that you could hold on to what you have, the fear of loss, the fear of
absolutely.
Yeah. And so when you're able to dive deep into that fear, into that wounding, into those traumas, into those spaces that you are asking people to look at, this is where that healing takes place. And you've given people the tools to do that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So I do have one last question for you before we wrap up. And that is, since writing the book and now since the book is out, what types of things have you learned from that point to this point? Has there been anything that has come up since you released the book where you're just like, oh, you know what? That came up and I wish I would have put that in the book?
Interestingly, there's always the decision about where to end a book, because in my case, this was my journey. And I finally at a certain point said to say, stop here. This is what's going to be the book. But then of course, I'm still making my path by walking. So I'm still on that journey. This is an ongoing unfolding. I can feel in the publication of the book, as I mentioned already, there's a kind of return. So in Joseph Campbell, who wrote so beautifully about in A Hero with a Thousand Faces, about he kind of laid out the archetypal heroes or heroines journey pattern, which is there's a descent, you're pulled down. There's the initiation that you go through in the you slay the dragons and all the things that you could say in the dark, and then you return again. And you come back and you've changed. And I would say I'm in the return cycle right now. And there have been many versions of this over the course of the 10 years, but there's a very specific return for me right now of coming to the upper world with, I could say my book is the pearl of great price, it's the thing that it was the gold in the wound. And I'm now stepping into that next phase of my work. I would say I've just continued to apply what I know. I'm on a path, and I'm making my path by walking, and it's still very much a mystery, but that's life,
Yeah.
Something has ended, though. This I know. Something has ended. Something completed with the book coming out, and it's going to be affecting the kinds of programs I do going forward, the sort of collaborations I'm in, things that'll be happening, but I'm not exactly sure what those will all be yet.
Yeah. It's so beautifully written, as I said earlier, and the way that you've described the 8 ways. And I'm sorry, you called them something else before. Can you remind me?
I call them mysterial metacapacities because it's like higher level. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So with the 8 metacapacities in the book, you write it almost as prose, and I find that really beautiful because it almost makes your conscious brain take a step back, and you're reading
Right.
it from a beautiful, creative space, which allows you to receive the information from an energetic place versus a mental place, which.
Well, that was the idea. So each one of these, I think what you're referring to is at the beginning of each one of these 8 metacapacities, I just sort of channeled almost, I call it an evolutionary invocation or invitation, because I wanted you to be able, the reader to be able to picture themselves with multidimensional knowing. What is that?
Yeah.
So it's sort of written in this evocative way. And I really hope people slow down and do that reading and return to it and go, yeah, I think I'm really working right now on embracing paradox, or my life is full of all these complexities. And then just to read that little prayer and get it in the body, what it would be like to be someone with that consciousness and capacity.
Yeah. So anybody out there who is reading the book, who is going to read the book, do not breeze through that, because it stopped me in my tracks. It did. It was like, obviously I was enjoying reading the story and knowing your experience and everything else. But the second I saw that, it literally, it's almost like it pulled me to drop in. And
was there one in particular, one of the 8 capacities that you read that invocation and you thought, that's where I want more of that in my life right now?
It was, and I don't remember the name of it. I apologize, but I believe it was the second one.
The second one would have been Unfolding the Emergent.
Yes.
Yeah, that is an absolutely beautiful capacity to cultivate. And it's sort of what I was referring to a moment ago. It's very much what I'm doing right now, is unfolding the emergent, which is such a different way of being in the world, where you're actually paying attention to all the signs and signals. You are doing what we kind of call dynamic steering, which is, again, paying attention to the next step, the thing you need to step onto right now. And you let the thing unfold rather than drive things into manifestation, which usually means we cut ourselves short from what we might have manifested, in my opinion. That's great.
Do you mind if I read it?
Oh, no, it'd be great.
It says, an evolutionary invitation, unfolding the emergent. Meditate on the words below and let them evoke your body, heart, mind, and soul. Imagine yourself as a woman on the edge of the evolution, unfolding the emergent. Everything, every single thing unfolds in the grace of time. You remove what blocks the flow and gasp in delight at what is revealed before your innocent eyes. Visualizing your clear desire out ahead in the future, you surrender to how you journey there. Follow the path seen and then not seen. You walk hand in hand with the mystery. Parts of you travel far ahead of your fears, willing to not know, to pay attention to signs and signals, to let some things go and others emerge, to be surprised by life. What moves you comes from the heart of wonder, not a stranger here on this good earth. You are a co-creator unfolding a world of beauty and possibility. That is so, it's so relevant to our conversation today as well, with being in the unknown, in that mysterious space, being in that space of allowing the unfolding to happen. And it's such an important way of being.
Thank you. What a beautiful way to end. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. How do people get a hold of you if they want to know new things that are happening, that sort of thing? So if you want to give the listeners your website and how to sign up.
Yeah, I'd say my website is a great place to start. Mysterial, mysterial woman.com. You'll find out more about the work that we do and the kinds of programs that we run. There's a page for the book, for both of my books, actually. And also, I've created a poetry resource for the second book, because poetry was such an important part of my own holding during the trauma, so that you might find that useful.
Beautiful.
And sign up on the website to join us in our Mysterial Murmuration. And then I send out newsletters every couple of weeks with things that I'm thinking, and podcasts like this one that are going out. And I'll be doing a program in the fall that will be based around this, on resilience. You make your path by walking. So get on the mailing list and stay tuned.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your path and everything. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you, Annette, for the invitation.
Again, Suzanne's book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead, is her previous book. And her new book, if you would like to pick it up, you can get it on Amazon, is You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish you a wonderful week. And stay tuned for next week's episode, which will be out on Wednesday.
Have an amazing day and never stop exploring your soul, because it is the most important relationship you will ever have. If you are interested in learning more about me and the sessions that I do, feel free to go to my website at infinitesoullove.com. On all social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Infinite Soul Love 1111. Hey, and if you feel called, I would love it if you could rate The Heart of You on whatever streaming service you're using, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Please take a moment, give it a review. It really does help the channel. Thanks so much.